It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our presenter. Dr. Allison Metz is a fellow at the University of North Carolina's Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute and a developmental psychologist, professor of practice and director of implementation practice at the School of Social Work. She's a former director of the National Implementation Research Network, also known as NIRN. And she's an adjunct professor at the Gillings School of Global Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She specializes in the implementation of evidence to achieve social impact for children and families in a range of human service and educational areas, with an emphasis on child welfare and early childhood service contexts. We are so glad that you are here, Allison. I'm going to pass it on over to you now.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for being here. We were just talking about the pros and cons of all the virtual work that we're still doing. So definitely some pros in terms of getting folks from, different areas and who have limited time to be able to come together. But we also know sometimes it's hard when we're not in person and connecting. So we have about an hour and a half together this afternoon for me. I know folks are in different time zones, and we will do a couple breakout sessions. But I want you to know that the breakout sessions are totally low burden. They're really it's gonna pose a reflective question on some really cool things and just get you guys chatting. So there won't be a heavy lift. And so I know sometimes folks kind of dread breakouts. So I just want you to know that it feels like a good time to chat with your colleagues about some of the topics that we're going to discuss today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which we just practiced a few times. So we're going to hope that it works out really well again. So here I go. So does that look okay to you, Faith? Yes, it does.
I'm on mute. Yes, it does.
Okay, great. I could tell you were smiling. So that seems good. And I was able to move my chat to the other monitor. So I feel like we're in good shape. So I'm going to move us over and just kind of walk through the agenda for our time together. So I will do a very brief overview of implementation science. So just a couple of slides. And then I'm going to introduce this idea of stages in implementation science. But the main thing that we're going to talk about today are the skills, the competencies that we as implementation practitioners really use to help people move through the stages of implementation. So maybe a little bit of a different take on implementation than folks may be familiar with. So hopefully this feels kind of new to everyone. So we're going to dig a little deep on a couple areas, which is developing relationships and the role of trust in implementation. It's incredibly interesting topic and one that I've been spending a lot of time on the last 2 or 3 years. And then also going to do some work around developing and supporting teams. We're going to touch upon this idea of psychological safety and how important that is in teamwork, and that some of those concepts which are talked about in other fields have been less talked about in implementation. And I think we all know that things like trust and safety are really critical for people to be able to participate in implementation efforts. So I want to talk about that. And that's what your breakout sessions are going to be about. So hopefully it gives you all a chance to reflect on your own practice and your own experiences as you implement new things or support others to implement. And then we'll just have a brief closing. So before we jump in, I actually was in a meeting the other day, and someone started the meeting by simply coming in and saying, pumpkin spice, yay or nay? And I thought it was the cutest check-in question ever, because it really led to a lot of discussion, because some people like pumpkin, but only savory, like curry. Other people like pumpkin, but only sweet, like pumpkin pie. We had a lot of people that don't like pumpkin spice lattes, but do enjoy a slice of pumpkin bread. So there are a lot of opinions about pumpkins this time of year. And so I thought for fun, you guys could put in the chat just your name and your pronouns, what role you play, how you're doing today, and pumpkin spice, yay or nay. So I would put Allison Metz, my pronouns are she, her. I would note that I'm a professor at the school. I'm fine. today, and I am yay on pumpkin spice, yay on everything sweet and savory. So just a few things into the chat. I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes of warm up to do that, and we'll just have a little fun seeing how much this group likes pumpkin spice or not. So I will monitor the chat as we do this. Oh, I love it, Missy. So thank you're nay on pumpkin spice, but you love the candles. This is what I mean. People are very particular about the pumpkin. Okay, Megan, thank you. You're doing well today. Yay to pumpkin spice, but nay to lattes. Yes, that is very common. I don't know who's drinking all those pumpkin spice lattes at Starbucks, but I haven't really found those people yet. Thank you for putting in your pronouns. That's great. Tired, yes. Yay to pumpkin spice. Nay to the latte. This is so funny to me. We should be like the focus group for Starbucks because I'm unclear who's having all those. Love apple spice, but no to pumpkin spice. Doing great. I'm happy to that. Pumpkin bread. Right. Everyone does seem to like pumpkin bread. That is true. I love it. Apple spice. People love the apple spice. Give me all the pumpkin. That's me. I even like to toast my pumpkin seeds after I, make my lanterns. Brittany, I'm feeling relaxed. I'm glad you're relaxed and got a long walk. Yay to pumpkin. Oh, we have a yay to pumpkin spice lattes. Okay, that's good. Glad to be here at 3 a.m. So we have a totally different time zone. Someone's here at 3 a.m. Thank you. Yay to pumpkin turnover. Cake and pie, so sweet and savory. I love it. I love pumpkin pie, but hate everything else pumpkin. Now, I will tell you, I just did this with another group, and we had a lot of non-pumpkin pie folks too, because that like gelatin feel of the pumpkin, the pumpkin pie, some people find a little gross. I don't. I love pumpkin pie, but it was interesting. Some strong reactions to that. So Faith, you're with me on that. Oh, but you hate everything else. That's great. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. It's a very cute check-in this time of year. So I'm happy about that. And I hope everyone is starting to experience some fall weather that I think with COVID, like the changing of seasons feels more meaningful and hopeful the last 22 months. Every time we kind of change seasons, I feel a sense of renewed hope. So the little bit of a chill in the air now is making me happy. So thank you guys for checking in with me. So I noted I'm going to kick us off with just a little bit of an introduction to implementation science, just a tiny one, and then we'll get into those skills and competencies. So the goal of implementation science, the overall goal of the whole field, is to integrate research and practice experience in ways that improve the outcomes of those being served. So that is the goal. And that's a really important thing for us to think about in our own work as we think about how implementation can advance equity. It's really important to think about the intentions of our work and the impact of our work. So hopefully we can bring that into the conversation today as we think about kind of this idea of trust and psychological safety and how critical it is to achieving our results. It's not all technical work. There's some other pieces to the implementation puzzle that we need to focus on. So when I think about implementation science, I think of it as including two things: implementation research and implementation practice. So in the field of implementation science for the last 10 or 15 years, I've heard people say a lot, the science and practice of implementation. And I have to say, true disclosure here, that's always bothered me a bit, because it kind of marks the practice piece. It puts it on the outside of the science. And I actually think it's a virtuous cycle between research and practice that creates the science, the knowledge that we have about what it takes to implement things well and to sustain them. So if you think about implementation research, the goal of that is to understand the approaches and strategies that help us move research evidence into practice. So, you know, for us, that's always kind of asking the question, you know, is this coaching strategy going to be helpful to move this evidence-based curriculum into practice? Like, what do we need to do with teachers and early childcare educators? And we're always thinking about that from an implementation research perspective. And that is what has yielded things like implementation theory, models, frameworks, like Faith, you were talking before we got on, like the implementation drivers, that triangle that some folks might be familiar with from NERN, the idea of implementation stages that I'm going to talk about, that all comes from implementation research as we study what it takes to implement. However, we also know that we have to apply and adapt those things in our everyday practice for different contexts. So I just gave that example that one thing that implementation research has taught us is that coaching matters, that training alone is not enough, that people do need coaching. So research tells us that, but implementation practice lets us test out different ways to bring coaching into the context or the setting. Because we know, for example, one-on-one coaching might not be feasible. So we might test out peer coaching or group coaching, you know, other collaborative models like that. And that should raise new questions for the field to then test around coaching. Does that make sense? So it's this virtuous cycle between research kind of telling us what to try out, and then in practice, we give it a try, and it most likely yields new information and new questions about the work, because most of us are working in really complicated and complex service settings on a regular basis. So one of the things, as I mentioned, that implementation research has identified is this idea that implementation happens in stages. So regardless of what framework or model you look at in implementation, there will be this idea that implementation is developmental, not necessarily linear, or you would kind of see this in a straight line. We know that we kind of often take, you know, a step forward and sometimes 2 steps back because, you know, there are shifts in funding, or there's a policy change or a leadership change. So we know that we're constantly ebbing and flowing with implementation, but the goal being that we progress across these stages of implementation. And so I wanted to just touch base on what these 4 stages are, so that I can then talk about this idea of how certain skills and competencies are needed to move us through these stages. We make progress based on the types of activities that we engage in each of these stages. So from a technical perspective, you know, exploration is that first stage, and we're assessing our needs, understanding the strengths of the context that we're working in, the population we'll be working with, identifying possible programs or practices to meet those needs, and developing an implementation team that's going to help us see the work forward. Hold on one second. I want to mute, but I don't have the ability because I'm on full screen. Thank you. I'm getting over a bit of a cold. It's not COVID, luckily, but I am getting over a little bit of an illness. So, and we have to create that readiness for change. And then the benchmarks that we see to know that we're moving through exploration are that we've demonstrated need, that we understand what would be a good fit for the context and the population, and that we see that it's acceptable and appropriate. So people are saying, yes, this would be good for us. And yes, this is a totally good fit for where we want to implement. Installation is once you've made the choice to move forward with a particular program or practice, you need to put resources in place so that you have an infrastructure to do the work. So these would be things like getting that training and coaching in place for staff, ensuring that you have a data system that's going to produce data reports that allow you to know how things are going. You might also need to put certain policies or procedures in place to support the work. So we'd see these benchmarks of progress when we see people getting trained, getting coached, having these new policies put in place, having a data system put in place. So these signs that we are actually going to adopt this new way of work. We have a visible infrastructure. That's the second stage. The third stage is when we actually launch new ways of work. So we've explored, we've installed the infrastructure, we're moving forward. And the real hallmark of this stage is continuous improvement. We're trying things out. So that benchmarks for this stage are that we have variability in implementation. Not everyone is able to implement what we want them to implement well or consistently, but we have some evidence that it's feasible to do. So we're trying something out and we can tell, okay, we're going to be able to do this. So I always kind of give an example, like if it's a home visiting program, for example, we know it's feasible if we've been able to actually engage families on a first visit. It may not mean that all of our practitioners are able to implement the evidence-based home visiting curriculum well or consistently. We're working on that, but we know that it's feasible to implement, that we have some early signs of success, and that families are letting us in for a second visit. We might, by the end of this stage, start to see some short-term outcomes for children and families as well. And then finally, we're in full implementation when really we see, high fidelity to the model. We can actually start to see longer term outcomes related to children and families. And we know that while there is still some variability, that most people are demonstrating that fidelity, and that supervisors are able to coach to that fidelity, and the data is being used regularly in a systematic way. So those reports that we started running in initial implementation, those things are happening really seamlessly, and we have a really strong infrastructure for the work. And the big outcome we'd hope to see there would be sustainability. So for a big part of my career, I was really kind of focused on these 4 stages and able to kind of help people know what stage they were in, what activities still needed to be conducted so they could complete the stage, even knowing that they might end up having to go back sometimes. We were able to really assess those benchmarks for progress. But one of the things we didn't talk too much about for a really long time was, what are we doing during those stages? What are we actually doing that help people move from one stage to the next? It kind of is almost like, we talked about part of the recipe, but not all of it, right? So there was this stuff that was kind of happening under the surface through our relationships, through the support that we delivered, through the types of implementation strategies that we chose. Like, for example, I noted in exploration, you want to start an implementation team. That seems, feasible to do and kind of self-explanatory, but it's actually not. There's so many questions about who should be on a team. How do you build their capacity? How do you build a cohesive team, a team that trusts each other, that can have healthy conflicts, that can raise issues? These were the things, we were often kind of doing every day in our work, kind of creating the container for the work to happen in the sites that we were working in, but we really weren't writing it down very, and talking about it. So over the last 5 years, we've spent a lot of time documenting the skills and competencies for supporting implementation efforts. So these are things that, as a technical assistance provider, you might be using in your everyday practice, but it's also as you build the capacity of the service settings that you're working in, these skills and competencies are important for people who might not necessarily think of themselves as implementation specialists, but part of their job involves supporting change. And when you're supporting change, there are often these kind of areas of competency that are really helpful to be able to move things forward. I was mentioning to Faith before we got on that we've done a lot of research on these as well. So have a lot of publications in this area and have kind of a research program around this idea of implementation practice. All of these things are downloadable too that I'm going to walk through. These practice guides. Everything's fully open source. So folks can certainly go to the website, which is, I think, on the final slide, and just download any of this information. But when we think about implementation competencies. We refer to them as implementation support practitioner competencies. That's kind of a mouthful, I know. And we used to call them implementation practitioner competencies, but we know that the word practitioner is often used for folks who are doing direct service. And really what we were thinking about were people often kind of up a level in the system, supporting those doing direct service. So the folks that were providing implementation support, but weren't necessarily, implementation researchers. They were people that were really doing this every day. And technical assistance providers really come to mind as a great example of an implementation support practitioner. So we thought about what are the principles that guide our work? And that's what's in the center here. The values that we hold in all of the implementation interactions that we have. So I'm going to talk about those in just a moment. And we know that as we move across these three circles, that there were three areas that really stood out to us, three large domains. One was around co-creation and engagement. So how is it that we are supporting stakeholder engagement, that we are supporting co-learning, that we're addressing issues of power and privilege that come up in implementation? This happens all the time when we're not involving families or practitioners in our work as we make implementation decisions. How are we co-designing those implementation strategies with the end user in mind? So these were things that felt really important to us, and they take a set of skills to do it. Ongoing improvement. This one might seem kind of more obvious in the sense that a big part of implementation is continuous improvement. So there's a lot that falls into this domain. How we have an ongoing assessment of need and strength in a service setting. How do we understand context? Our ability to select implementation strategies and to change course if needed. So, we might think, we're gonna use this team development or this coaching approach or this fidelity monitoring system. But, later we find out from information we're collecting that that's not working as well. So an implementation support practitioner needs to be pretty nimble in her practice and be able to say, okay, we might need to look at another set of strategies for this work. Facilitation. So how we facilitate team meetings with a focus on supporting improvement. Communication, and then ongoing improvement cycles, which are things that folks might be familiar with, like the concept of plan, do, study, act cycles, things like that. That's a bunch of things, and maybe it's not that one person has all of these skills, but we often know that it takes a team to support implementation. So you need folks that are really good at, brokering and building relationships, and folks that are really good at data use and being able to help with the technical part of the work. And then finally, sustaining change. We believe that sustainability is really the result of those relationships that we have, and the trust is foundational to the work. We believe that teams and distributed leadership are really critical for moving the work forward. You'll see on a later slide that we really talk about shedding that solo leader model of implementation. How we build capacity. Such a big thing, but we think about capacity in all different ways. People's analytic capacity, their adaptive capacity, because implementation, is unforgiving and there's all sorts of things that come up. So how do we build others' capacity, the team's capacity to be able to kind of roll with challenges and to be able to make good decisions when barriers are faced? And how do we cultivate implementation leaders and champions in the work? There's been a lot of studies recently on the role of champions and how critical they are to supporting work moving forward. So this is where we kind of landed. And today I'm only going to talk about a couple of these. There's 15 of them across these three domains, 15 competencies. Today I'm just going to talk about a couple. Before I do that, I do want to highlight that center of the circle. So one of the things that we think is so critical is to be really aware of the principles, the foundational attitudes that guide our work, that guide the way that we interact with teams, the way we interact with all of our implementation partners, with community partners, with families in this work. So we believe that empathy is just a critical part of implementation, the ability to be empathic, to take others' perspectives and to value them as legitimate as your own is absolutely critical. To remain curious. So this idea of active listening needs to be well operationalized. In this kind of today, because I'm delivering a PowerPoint to you guys, but I started out in my career like 15 years ago, kind of coming in with, 80 slide PowerPoint deck, like here are the frameworks we're going to use. I think, I look back on that now and think, I don't think I asked enough questions. We kind of came in with the solutions. And we now know that sustainability really rests on those solutions being co-created. So our ability to be curious is so important. We've learned from folks that being committed is really critical. Demonstrating that you're in this for the long term is so important to those that you're working with. Advancing equity. So I will encourage folks, we have in this area, I'm happy to put this in the chat. We just released a special issue of the Stanford Social Innovation Review with case examples of how implementation can be used to decrease disparities in outcomes. And it's a part of the field that has not done enough. As a matter of fact, there's probably aspects of the field of implementation science that have exacerbated disparities. The idea that we work with the ready, the idea we do readiness assessments, and then we work with those who are ready. The idea that we are those who just is ready. These are all things that have really, I think, been a challenge for the field in reaching that lofty goal of improving outcomes, and that's for all people. So these are things that I want us to think about today as we think about our own skills and competencies, the extent to which we use critical thinking in our work, so that we are, that we are analytical, that we are methodical, that we are taking data and information in, that we try not to have conversations that don't involve data, and that we're getting data from the right sources. Again, that includes the end user in all aspects of the work. Embrace cross-disciplinary approaches. So that means that we embrace different ways of knowing. And that, yes, we support the use of research evidence in practice, but we don't privilege research evidence over other types of evidence. And that we're again looking to innovate and build evidence with the communities that we're working with. So I'm just going to pop in the chat and just make sure. Looks like nothing additional in the chat just yet. So feel free to populate the chat as I'm talking, and we can kind of pause and look at that. We're going to have a little bit of time soon, and probably just about 10 or 15 minutes to kind of go into breakouts and have a deeper conversation about work. But I mentioned I was going to highlight 2 of those 15 competencies on that kind of flower graphic slide where I went through those 3 domains. And I chose these, I could have chosen any. I knew we had limited time today, but I wanted to show basically how the competencies really play a role in this idea of stage-based work. So kind of wedding implementation research, which is the stage idea, and implementation practice, which is what are we actually doing during each of these stages. And so I wanted to talk about teams because it is foundational to the work. Like you can't move through the stages unless you've actually gotten a team off the ground. And so that's something we talk about in exploration, but it really does carry through. And then when we've done some concept mapping of the competencies with stages, everyone that we've spoken to that does implementation work has said growing and sustaining relationships is just not something that can be mapped to a stage. It is of importance to the work, and it's actually the lever that moves you across the stages. So I thought, well, let me talk about something really foundational like teams, and let me talk about this idea of relationships and what we know about that and why that really is the kind of lever that you need to pull at each stage in order to keep making progress. So we'll start with this idea of relationships. So we know that trust is the cornerstone of effective partnerships. So we know that, and we know that implementation relies on collaborative learning, taking risks, and failure. And at the center of those three things is vulnerability and trust. So if implementation relies on those things, I'd be curious if you guys agree with me. I think it does. I think we need to be able to take a risk. I think we need to be able to fail. That is part of the work, the idea of ongoing learning, and that we need to do this collaboratively. All of those things do require some level of trust with our partners, and our ability to be vulnerable throughout implementation is something that will help develop our trust over time. Perhaps the most important foundation, as I talked about earlier, that really complements this idea of trust is empathy. So the idea that you understand the needs of others. You know, in my time kind of supporting this work, it's been really interesting. You know, we released a paper on this several years ago, but I still go back to it a lot. It was this idea that we were supporting implementation of a lot of evidence-based programs in a very large child welfare jurisdiction. And in the beginning, these different stakeholder groups spent a lot of time talking about how other people didn't understand the work. So you might have service providers basically saying, you don't know what we're up against. You might have people who purveyed specific evidence programs about fidelity and how no one understood how important fidelity was. You know, by the end of the work, we had met enough together and formed enough of a cohesive team that groups start to empathize with each other. So you might have a service provider saying, yeah, we're up against a lot, but I also understand what the funder needs from us and, you know, why they might be asking us to do this. Like these kinds of things started to happen. And I noticed like a little like light bulb went off, like people can start to empathize with each other. Implementation starts to move. And we need to engender trust through a pattern of being able to provide feedback and respond. So this idea of being super responsive is something that has come up as well, that we know that trust is not built through these kind of sweeping gestures, but it's built through frequent and actually fairly small interactions. So that comes back to that principle of commitment. We've got to be in this for the long term, because the only way you build trust is by demonstrating responsiveness over and over and over again. And then once that trust is built, you know, you kind of, you know, you have this platform for implementation that's kind of unstoppable in many ways. So in that practice guide that I showed you a screenshot of, that I said is fully downloadable for anyone, we go through in a lot of detail activities that can help to promote trust. And we're just now starting to develop a curriculum that helps people develop trust with their team members. So the idea, like, can we build the capacity of others to have trust building skills? Because we know that there's like a few things, again, that really do help contribute to trust. One of them being this idea of being really responsive and having real frequent interactions. It's interesting because in the COVID environment, since we're virtual so much, it's kind of like people think you have to build trust with these big 2-3 day in-person meetings. But the difference is with Zoom, we talk to each other a lot more frequently, because we're not waiting to do the big site visit. We might instead meet 10 times over Zoom. There's some evidence that actually builds more trust than had we done the big trip and been in person, if you can believe that. So that's really interesting. So we build trust by modeling transparency and accountability. We are constantly self-assessing ourselves. So how are we in developing relationships? What are our own strengths and weaknesses in doing that work? How are we making use of feedback that's provided to us when we're supporting implementation? How are we regulating distress in others? So how are we creating a container for the work where people do feel a sense of safety moving forward? How do we enter the implementation space with humility? So we need to enter that space as a learner and recognize that those who are local, who are more proud to the work, they have the expertise and the experience that is needed to contribute to the implementation process. I mentioned this before about demonstrating commitment, and we've talked about vulnerability and empathy. I'm going to talk a little bit more deeply about that as we move through these slides. A helpful hint in the practice guide, we give kind of a helpful hint for each of these competencies. So we mentioned here that we know that implementation takes place through trusting relationships. So the way you do that, honest listening, using feedback, demonstrating commitment, providing credible information, showing vulnerability, and staying in a difficult situation. We've done some research on this, and those few items that I just read off are the things that people say contribute to developing trust. So let me talk a little bit more about that research. So we had funding from the William T. Grant Foundation to really study the use of implementation strategies, child welfare systems and public child welfare systems to support the use of evidence-based programs and practices in those systems. And we did a series of interviews with folks that had been supporting this type of work for 15 or more years. So it had a lot of experience supporting the use of evidence-based programs. We asked questions about the strategies they used. We also asked questions about how they engage stakeholders. And then we asked the question about the role of relationships. And I'm not going to get into too much detail about these findings, but they are so interesting because we interviewed a broad range of folks. And when we asked about the strategies they used to support implementation of evidence-based programs, and many of them worked not just in child welfare, but in early childhood settings and generally child and family service settings, there was a breadth and a variability to how they talked about strategies. You know, there was a lot covered in those interviews. So not two people said the same thing. I mean, there was a lot covered there. Very interesting from an implementation science perspective, when you kind of think there's these 10 big strategies that everyone should be using, there was a pretty big breadth in what people said. We asked about stakeholder engagement. There was a bit less variability. People talked about the importance of that, the strategies they used to do it. Working on that had grown over time. But there was still some variability. When we got to the questions about trust and relationships, the depth and uniformity of those answers were unbelievable. I mean, you really could have just hit play on the recording. Every single person that we interviewed that has been doing this work a really long time and has a lot of respect in the field said the exact same things about trust and relationships. That was another light bulb moment for me where I was like, oh, that's interesting. People may choose different strategies, but it sounds like trusting relationships is the paramount strategy, because without that, none of the other strategies actually work. People describe relationships as important, critical, essential, and foundational. They indicated it was at the core or heart of the work. And trusting relationships appeared to foster an environment in which change efforts were both optimized and sustained. So the next two slides you'll see along the bottom, I write these words: authenticity, vulnerability, and empathy. And that's because we ask people two questions. How do you build trust? And how do you know you're in a trusting relationship? So they were two different questions. However, authenticity, vulnerability were described as both. So the more empathic you are, the more likely you are to build trust. You know you're in a trusting relationship when someone's empathic with you, right? So those three came up as a both. It's how you build it and how you know you're in a trusting relationship. But the other big ones that were said in terms of building trust, people said entering the implementation work with humility, always being honest, demonstrating credibility. So having information that's useful, demonstrating some level of expertise. So that was interesting, right? So you have to be both have humility, but also demonstrate credibility. So you have to be able to kind of walk both of those lines. Being responsive and demonstrating commitment, I mentioned on the earlier slides. that the more responsive you are and the more you show people that you're in it for the long haul, the more likely you are to build trust. While these things might seem obvious, I haven't seen a lot of research on the field of implementation science that really gets at these things. And I think this is important because I think if we want to build a workforce that can build trust, we need to kind of be able to talk with our colleagues and just remind them how important it is to enter with humility, you know, when they have the 80 PowerPoint slides ready to go, to kind of talk about what it means for the space in a different way. People knew they were in a trusting relationship as it relates again to implementation. These questions were all about implementation efforts. When there was transparency, when there was a sense of mutuality, we're in this together. We feel mutually accountable for the outcomes. There isn't one group that feels more accountable over another. This is asked again of people that were supporting implementation. Out of actually these 5 on this slide, I will tell you that the number one was comfort asking for help. When someone, if you are supporting an agency to implement and they feel comfortable asking you for help, that's a huge sign that trust is. How you share information regularly, and again, related to that first one, transparently, and the capacity to stay in a difficult situation or the capacity to stay in a difficult conversation. So if folks are familiar with the concept of adaptive leadership, maintaining disciplined attention, this one came up, the ability to stay, to not just exit stage left because you're tired of having that conversation, but the ability to stay in that conversation was the sign that you were in a trusting relationship. We're going to head to breakout rooms to talk about this idea of trust in your own work. But what I would love to do is just, if folks have some additional thoughts about this that they'd like to share now before you go into breakouts, I would love to hear like the extent that this is resonating or kind of what's coming up for you in your own practice or experience. You can just pop it in the chat if you want, but I'll just wait a minute and see if anyone wants to share anything before we go to the breakouts. Yeah, you know, it's such an interesting question, Missy. It's yes, I had anecdotally, and I was talking about this before. I think we're going to do like a workforce initiative series for our institute events, and one of them I want to do on resilience, because what I've noticed for the first time in the field of implementation science is there are articles coming out on resilience. So not just of those implementing, but those who support implementation. So the resilience of TA providers, like during COVID. There's 2 articles that just came out on that. And I think they're fascinating and really speak to this idea of burnout when you do this type of work. For all the reasons I bet you guys could all name very quickly in your own minds about why this work is so hard. And so I have this like huge interest in the lived experience of those that provide TA. I think it's so interesting for those who've made a career out of it and have been doing it a long time. Megan, this is so reinforcing for me. My team was held separate for so many relationship with those we support. Yep. And COVID created an opening to relationships. We're working on trust building and empathy right now. Yes. Thank you so much, Megan. The notion that resonates so greatly somewhere, especially in the field of early childhood. The Guam PDG family engagement coordinator is so great at this and always reminds us how important relationships are. I love that family engagement coordinator, whoever he or she is out there. That's phenomenal. Yes, Maggie, absolutely. And one of the things that we talk about is how to address power differentials. And I'm in this with you as well because I'm funded to do my work. And so there's also power imbalances with funders as well. And sometimes there's this like sense of urgency to the work that falls in the face of actually developing the relationships. And so I think we're constantly trying to balance that and need to have a support group around how to do that for sure. I've become more vocal in my old age in terms of slowing things down. But earlier in my career, I think I was too nervous to do that and spent a lot of time just trying to meet deliverables. Okay, I'm going to let you guys go to breakouts. So yes, thank you for the question about number of breakouts. Yeah, I think let's go with 4 rooms. So that would give us about 5.25 person a room. And I think let's go for about 8 minutes. And there's one thing I would love, let me see. Is it possible to drop those 2 questions into the chat? I'm sorry, I'm not able to do it because I can't copy from this PowerPoint, but the 2 questions are,
Sure.
the
I
chat,
can do that.
thank you so much, because the
No
chat will
problem.
follow you to your breakout room. So how have relationships contributed to building commitment and resilience in your own work? So how have relationships contributed to building commitment and resilience in your own work? And you might just chew on that for 8 minutes or so. But if you have time, the other question that we ask from a kind of a research perspective is, are relationships as important as strategies for successful implementation of programs and practices? So, we're constantly talking about all these strategies we want to use, like, fidelity monitoring. And I'm not saying it's not important to monitor fidelity, but it's interesting when people kind of juxtapose that with relationships, what comes up for you. But focus more on the first question. It's more about you. And as I said, I want this to be like a low cognitive burden. Like, I want you to go to this breakout. I want you to be more yourself and emotional and just talk about your own work and how relationships have helped you be resilient. So let's like 8 minutes, if that's possible. And then we'll come back. And if you guys have anything else to add, we can do that. I agree with you, Anita. How busy we are.
Hey, Faith, I went over there and I was like, this seems like a conversation they should have without me.
By people working in public systems. And, when everything's an emergency for 22 months, it can feel like that. And then someone else brought up this idea of blurred boundaries, because we already had those with the constant use of, iPhones and whatnot. We're always available. But I think people know you're not traveling, for example. There's just this constant, why are you not available? And I think many of us are spending, more than 8 hours on Zoom some days. And that's weird. It's like really weird. Yeah. What else came up for folks in their group that you want to share out with everybody?
I think, go ahead, Liz. Go ahead, Liz.
I was just going to say that one of the things our group talked about was having the right people at the table that's making the decisions. Especially Elaine brought up about the ARP funds and who's controlling that, and just the power struggle between our legislators and our governor. So go ahead, Elaine, you can expand.
But I think it's just to part of our role is to share and to continue to give that information. However, whatever decision she had made must be for a reason. And so I like that whole notion about, trying to figure out understanding, but also share, what are some of the things, the data, what are the things that our needs assessment is saying, right? Just, having her make that connection. But I think one of our colleagues from Illinois, because she works at the governor's office, is just making sure that, we weren't on the table, but how do we make sure we're on the table and that messages continue to be clear that investing in the early years is so important. It's going to impact, the future. And if we're continually just trying to do things right away, that's not going to show impact or quality of services and to support kids, then, the ARP is the results are going to be the same unless we start looking at more long-term impact, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. Anything else anyone wants to share before we jump back in?
I think relationship is so important, and maybe rebridging that, reconnecting, right? That relationship that may be missing at this point, just because we're all so busy with like you said, this whole 2 years that we forget, right? Or we're just so into our trying to deal with the emerging need, and so I think that's important. That's something that I think I need to continue to work on.
Thank you.
This is Tammy Proctor with the U.S. Department of Education, and I spoke to my group from a little different, not different perspective, but the importance of the relationships that has been formed with the career staff at HHS and at Ed, to the level that we have maneuvered through 3 administrations, from early childhood being the center, early childhood not being the center, and early childhood becoming, being a center again, and the importance of what it meant for us to have relationships to continue to do the work, even when the work was not at the center of the priority, and being able to continue to support states and demonstrate for them the importance of relationships, and being able to honestly look at the many early childhood programs and different funding streams that were coming out the door, and being able to look and see where our policies overlap, where the practices can be of shared resources, and just looking at how we could, at the federal level, make the picture clearer for those at the state level. And so, we couldn't do that without the relationships that we have built over the last decade or more. And so continuing to be able to do that has been important to us at the federal level, being able to continue to support states. So
thank you so much for saying that. And it is, there's so much in that, but the community of professionals that support this work, there is a lot of continuity there, and there are a lot of deep relationships, and even as we have administration changes, both state level and federal, there are folks that don't change with that. I'm thinking about that with our incredible civil servants. My husband's a civil servant at Department of Education, Tammy, and so the idea that there are people that have been championing this work for a really long time, and even when things seem, dire. There are people that are really working and are looking to make those connections and find ways to support the work. And I have been really heartened by that myself over the last, 15 years or so. And there's been lots of changes, but somehow there is still really good work that goes on for young children and families. So I really appreciate that reminder.
And thank you for keeping Ed championing this work as well.
I know, that's so funny. These good connections. I'll tell him when I get off. Yeah, that's so great. I love it. I love it. All right. Well, it's no surprise that we're behind, because that's the story of my life. No matter how many times I've been doing this, I've never been on time in a presentation. So I've kind of almost given up on that. But I'm going to go back. We're going to talk about the second one, which is teams. And I'm going to touch upon a few of the things I want to touch on with it. And we'll definitely, close up a couple minutes before 3. Or before wherever folks are. I know we have folks who got on at 3:15 in the morning. So I know our colleagues are unbelievable. So I'm blown away by that, I have to say. So I feel like, I hope I'm not letting you down in some way, given how early you had to get up. So thank you guys for that. I think I have to share my screen again, right, Faith? Yes. Oh my Lord. Let's hope I can do it.
You'll be fine.
Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay. Am I good?
It's in presenter mode, so we see all of your.
You see the notes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I have to end and stop sharing and then reshare. Okay. So I'm gonna try again.
Mhm.
Okay.
So now go ahead and play from current slide. There we go. Got it.
That good? All right.
Yes.
So Faith knows I have 3 monitors in my little home office here. So it's a killer with this sharing screens. It never works the same way twice. So the other piece, and this is so similar to relationships, is developing teams. And I will say this, it's interesting. I write a lot of proposals, lots of scopes of work to support implementation. And our team at NERN, and a lot of the folks from NERN came over with me to school social work to support some new work there. We constantly talk about the thing that we under budget for the most is developing teams. It is because there's so much work involved in that, in terms of building the team, supporting their capacity development, but also some of the other things that we're going to talk about, which relate to the trust and relationships, which is how do we build a cohesive team? So how do we build a team that, noted at the very top of the presentation, can wrestle with healthy conflict, can be focused on a result together, even if they wear different hats, and they're kind of representing different constituents as they kind of sit on the team. And so there's a lot that needs to happen. I'm constantly reminded of, do you guys know the Iceberg Model? So the idea, right? So folks know that. So you kind of think about most of implementation science has focused on the top of the iceberg, what's above the water. So how many trainings can we do? And, that kind of stuff. And so much of what makes implementation successful is what's happening beneath the iceberg. It's people's values, people's kind of, sense of buy-in. There's so much that happens underneath that model, underneath the waterline. So we know that a big piece of the work that we do is to develop teams. So having to identify those team members, develop clear governance structures for our teams, so critical to work with teams on how decisions will be made. It's like one of the most important things you have to work with on a team, and everyone likes to avoid that topic, but it's really important to talk with teams about how decisions will be made. But teams are doing so much related to implementation. They might be kind of thinking about selecting programs or practices, tailoring them, adapting them, kind of figuring out how to build staff competency. So what will those training and coaching strategies look like? Teams are often engaged with data use. So they're thinking about the types of data reports that need to be run. who needs to engage with that data? Data is the best convener, right? Like, how do you get people around data to offer kind of multiple perspectives on why the data look the way they look? Building capacity to sustain whatever it is that we're taking on. So teams need to have a real forward, vision for the work. What is it that will allow us to continue to do this past an initial funding cycle? And building those cross-sector collaborations, which are really, really critical for that sustainability. So we talk a lot about in this practice guide, all those activities, but this helpful hint, just honing in on this idea that a lot of the teams up front matters so much. So we avoid sometimes what feels like process work or sometimes busy work because we are running with this sense of urgency. But developing team charters and agendas for meetings matter so much. I think we've all been to an agendaless meeting, and it's typically not that successful. And so trust me, I still have agendaless meetings all the time, but I do try to put together agendas, even for the smallest meeting. Hold space to be able to have people reflect and know that this is what we're going to cover, to get familiar with that, to send it out ahead of time so people clearly understand their role, that people feel safe entering the meeting. There's not going to be any surprises. They know what the agenda topics will be. I think those things matter an enormous amount, as well as getting that charter in place so that teams know what's their purpose, what's the scope of their work, how will those decisions be made, how will they engage with other groups that are involved in the effort as well, because often things we're doing are kind of big, and there's multiple work groups involved. And I always say, you can't just know what your work group is doing. You have to know what your work group is doing vis-a-vis another work group or team. So I also noted earlier, one of the things that's so important for teams is really shedding this solo hero kind of approach to implementation, that we can have like a single leader that moves implementation forward. We know that that's not the case. And one of the reasons it isn't just because there's turnover at leadership levels as well, but because we are often dealing with those kind of complicated implementation barriers, and a single perspective on that is not going to be able to come up with the best solution. Sometimes, that could be the case, but for the most part, we need to engage people that sit in different positions and can see the work differently. And again, this would also include families that we serve, teachers that we work with. Understanding their perspective can be really eye-opening. I think we spend a lot of time putting implementation strategies in place that are really never going to get anywhere because it's never what anyone really wanted in the first place. And so spending that time getting those perspectives by using your team is really helpful. The other thing that's really important is that teams feel psychologically safe. This is something I've come to learn, later in my career. And it seems, again, kind of obvious, but, you're so focused on getting the work done. In the breakout groups, I had a lot of people talking about deliverables and a sense of urgency. But the truth is we know from lots of studies on psychological safety, there are tons of systematic reviews on psychological safety, empirically studied stuff. This is not just I'm making this up, that teams that feel psychologically safe are way more successful. And those are teams where people on the team feel safe to take an interpersonal risk, to speak up, share concerns, to identify new ideas, to ask questions. So when there is silence, we cannot confuse silence with agreement. And that's something like I struggle with a lot because I run a lot of teams and a lot of big public systems, because we're often charged with like a big scaling initiative and we're bringing teams together. And I don't want to like put people in a position where I'm asking them to talk when they don't feel comfortable. But I also know if folks aren't talking, I need to be monitoring that, because I need to figure out, do I have to reach out in between the meeting? And this is why I noted that that this is one of the most technically under budgeted aspects of implementation, because the people involved need to feel cohesive and safe for the work to be super successful. Because if we have a lot that aren't talking, they're probably not bought in for some reason, and they're just kind of letting it move forward. And that's just not something that's helpful. So one of the things we know is that teams that are focused on creating this sense of safety, they plan forward. So they spend time identifying what could go wrong. Seems kind of negative, but it's actually kind of fun to do sometimes. They reflect back. So they talk about mistakes and ways to learn from them. That idea that errors and mistakes are good is something we have to kind of wrap our heads around. That they test change in everyday work activities. So they test out ideas. You know, they do something differently for, a month, and they come back to the team and talk about if it worked. They communicate really clearly. It's unbelievable how many times people who are part of implementation efforts have no idea what's going on. And it's because our communication protocols were not robust enough. They show appreciation. So we appreciate our colleagues. We talk about the unique skills that they bring to the team. Never underestimate how important it is to demonstrate appreciation. It is so meaningful to people, for myself included, not just demonstrating it, but receiving it. And they professionalism. So they're candid in their work, but they do it in a way that is kind, but they are candid. We do know that being clear and providing feedback is better than talking about things outside of the meeting, right? So there's some ideas. So there's some practices that people use, intentional affirmation. I noted candid feedback. There's some kind of skills you can learn in meetings that can be really, really helpful to a successful team. And there's also strategies or structures you can put in place. If you look down at that fourth dot point, deliberate decision-making, being really clear about how decisions get made is a critical structure to a team. So those are the kinds of things that can add to psychological safety. Rather than avoiding those topics, actually addressing them head on is really, really important. Are you guys familiar with this 5 dysfunctions of a team? You'll have to tell me in the chat. Let me move the chat over. If you are familiar with it, let me know. I was not familiar with it up until like 3 years ago. And I was working with the Annie Casey Foundation, and they use this to kick off all their teams. And then I started talking about it to different public child welfare systems. I do a lot of work with child welfare, and everyone knew about it. It's like, oh my gosh, like where have I? So I immediately got the book, and I read the book, and got the facilitator's guide, and I thought it was helpful. It basically walks through why teams are typically dysfunctional. So it starts at the bottom, this absence of trust, and moves its way up to intention to results. But if you flip it around, you can then flip it into what are the characteristics of a highly functioning team. So these are the things you want to cultivate. So in starting implementation teams now, we have kind of an arc of learning. So it's the work that the team has to do around implementation, reviewing data, conducting a needs assessment, looking at fidelity scores, whatever it is that team needs to do, assessing policies, they can do. However, there's all this other stuff that we have to be doing as well. So we have to make sure that they are building trust with each other, that they engage openly with one another, that they ask for help, that they offer back. So we're cultivating that they have to be able to master conflict. Conflict's okay. We can have healthy conflict. Achieving commitments. So they show no hesitation in revisiting discussions repeatedly. We have a joke on my team that we're willing to talk about something endlessly. You heard me say that later. I always say to folks, a bit of a rush, but don't worry, I'm happy to talk about that endlessly. And we will always revisit it, because I can tell if something's coming up because people are struggling. Embracing accountability, the sense of collective accountability goes back to that sense of mutuality. The idea that you, your partners, your funder all feel a sense of collective responsibility for the work, and you're focusing on one result or 2 or 3 results that team needs to achieve. So we've put some things in place, engaging in consistent meeting protocols, developing protocols for how to engage different stakeholder groups, structured facilitation techniques. There's all these things you can do to kind of avoid these things. So, you want the team to have a result in mind, and you want to do icebreaker work that creates trust. You want to, as a facilitator, manage conflict. When to kind of raise the heat and when to simmer things a little bit. Those are really important aspects of I think they've been avoided a little bit in implementation science because we're so focused on what the team's doing. And we're focused as much on whether that team is psychologically safe and cohesive and is going to achieve the best results we know. And we know from the business literature that that is what gets a really highly functioning team going. I don't think I'm going to put folks back into breakouts. We could do it for like 5 minutes, but I think that would feel rushed. So I'm happy to just ask this question and chat about it for a couple minutes. And I think Faith is going to close us out. So teams represent a new way of work for many organizations and systems. It's unbelievable how many groups I work with where teams is not the way of work. It's still the solo. So how does culture play a role in team success? And what have you found rewarding about participating in a team or supporting a team? So I'm happy to kind of hear any experiences around teams you might want to reflect on for a minute or two, and then we'll let Faith close you out. So you guys are saying that the 5 dysfunctions of a team is new to you as well. All right, doesn't make me, I feel okay that I was new to it. It was unbelievable how many people have heard of it. Any thoughts about your experience on teams?
I personally love working in teams because everyone has different strengths, and sometimes we have the same strengths, and it just makes the team better and building from that. And I love learning about what people can bring to the table. And I agree that failure is an important aspect of that, because that's one of the things that helps us to become better learners. I think we learn the most from the mistakes that we made.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
And I saw someone asked about the title of the book. If you just Google or go to Amazon, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, it'll pop up. It's a very popular kind of business book. Any other final thoughts?
I wanted to say thank you so much for this presentation. I didn't really know about implementation science before. And when you had mentioned being able to sit in conflict, that stuck out to me because I've been in a few teams where I get excited when someone is like, hold on, I don't agree with that. Or can we talk about this? Here's a red flag that's happening for me. And I've tried to bring that up to leadership of I think that's a sign of a good team that we're able to voice these differences. But now I feel I actually have the language to be yes, this is a good thing that we're trying to work through these problems. So thank you for adding that into my toolkit.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Faith, I'll turn it back to you. And I just want to thank everyone for joining. I enjoyed the conversations, and I'm sorry we didn't have a chance for the last breakout, but good to hear from you all.
Thank you, Dr. Metz. This was I echo Brittany. I just think it was a great presentation. I just think you shared so much information. I had shared with you, I was a little bit worried that it was going to be a implementation science, and we've heard that before, but you took us into a deep dive in building trusting relationships. And it was just such an important part, and it really resonated. And I think it resonated with a lot of our participants here. I really appreciated you sharing about the uniformity of the findings, that high quality trusting relationships, between the practitioners and partners. That was one of those key points. It just hit it home. The findings we are all on the same page. So it was just so much great information. Thank you. And then also those key activities and strategies for growing and sustaining trust in relationships. That was awesome. There's like I have a whole list of things that I was like, that's really great. That was really good information. So, but I'll stop there because before we go, I need to share two things with you. Corrado, would you mind sharing the slides? Again, would you be able to share there's two different places where you go for more information. One of them is the PDG Birth to 5 TA Center. We have a website, and I'm going to put that in the chat. Corrado has been having technical issues himself, so I'm not sure if his computer was freezing, so I'm not sure. But here is the chat. There is for the TA Center, and you can find all kinds of resources for states to about strengthening the mixed delivery systems in your states. And there's like all these different topics, like the big buckets of PDG. And then another place where you can get information is from the Research Connections. And it's about, that has like a lot of the topics that we are covering in this, in the annual convening itself, like all the kind of big buckets, systems building, data systems, mental health and socio-emotional learning, and then like the financial and the governance piece of it as well. So Research Connections has got lots and lots of like peer-reviewed research, really solid stuff. So please check those out. And I'd like to thank everyone, Dr. Metz, for sharing and taking the time to prepare for this really informative session, and for you participants being here, we really appreciate it. So with that, I'm going to say you have a couple of minutes, go get a drink, take a restroom break, because we've got a great research to practice plenary that I think is really exciting. So stay tuned. Bye, everyone.